The fluorescent lights at Oak Creek Memorial hummed at 120 cycles per second, and Sarah Chen had learned to count them the way she used to count seconds between mortar impacts in Sangin. She moved through the night shift corridors with the deliberate invisibility of someone who'd been ordered to disappear, her senior chief petty officer insignia buried deep alongside classified operations that officially never happened, sealed behind a non-disclosure agreement signed in a Pentagon basement under lighting designed to make you forget what day it was. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and floor wax and the particular staleness of air that had been recycled through fax systems for too long. Sarah's badge clattered softly against the plastic ID holder clipped to her scrubs as she moved from one room to the next, checking monitors, adjusting drips, reading charts with the careful attention that had kept soldiers alive under fire and was now threatening to expose the one person she'd already decided she could never trust. Dr. Sterling noticed her immediately during morning rounds. Not because of her competence was invisible to him, background noise, but because she actually read patient charts before administering medications, cross-referencing orders against contraindications, asking quiet questions about imaging recommendations that seemed perfectly routine to everyone else. A nurse who paid attention was a liability he could not afford. He watched her from across the fourth floor, his white coat hanging loose over a frame built more for golf courses than hospital corridors, and something about her careful efficiency made his jaw tighten. He'd been running the Precision Diagnostic Partners arrangement for 14 months now. Unnecessary CT scans, MRIs that patients didn't need, advanced imaging routed through his private center at $847 per procedure with a 30% kickback deposited directly into an offshore account in Grand Cayman. Simple math. 30 patients a month. $10,200 in untraceable income. The system worked because nobody read charts. Nobody questioned why a stable patient with stable vitals suddenly needed 3 advanced imaging studies. Nobody except night shift nurses who actually believed the job description that said patient advocate. Sarah's hands trembled slightly when she picked up a 22-gauge for catheter during her 11 p.m. medication pass. Not visible to anyone watching. Just a whisper of movement in her fingers, muscle memory from 100 battlefield traumas making her body remember protocols her mind had been ordered to forget. She set the catheter down, pressed her palms flat against the medication cart, took one measured breath. The tremor stopped. The nurse returned. The woman underneath stayed buried. She found herself drawn to room 447 around 1:56 a.m. during the quiet stretch when the hospital seemed to hold its breath. Captain Marcus Webb lay in the hospital bed with the posture of someone used to sleeping in combat positions, his bed angled away from the door in a way that let him see the corridor without turning his head. The chart noted he was deaf, had been since an IED fragmented his hearing during his first deployment in 2009. Special Forces. Bronze Star. Purple Heart. The combat notation read simply, prefers ASL communication. Sarah's pulse shifted the moment she read his name. Not in her chest. Not visible. Just a small change in the quality of her breath, the way her hand steadied as if remembering something her conscious mind hadn't yet accepted. Marcus Webb. Captain Marcus Webb. SEAL Team 3, Charlie Platoon. The commanding officer who'd personally briefed her 17-year-old son before the operation in Sangin, the one who'd sent the boy into the same valley where Sarah had barely escaped alive, the same mountains where she'd pulled 12 men out of an ambush after their position was compromised. She rolled her medication cart closer to his room and his eyes found hers immediately, not because he heard the wheels, but because he was watching. He was always watching. That was the kind of man who made it to command in Special Forces. She stepped into room 447 and raised her hand in a greeting that was older than words, a slight wave, fingers open and relaxed. She was fluent in American Sign Language. Had been since she was 23, before the Navy, before Sangin, before she became someone else entirely. He signed, night shift. She signed back, 12 hours. You need anything? His hands moved with the precision of someone who'd learned to communicate in silence, which meant learning to be clear about everything, monitors loud. Can't hear it anyway. But it annoys the nurses. Sarah almost smiled. Almost. She reached over and lowered the volume on the heart monitor from its default 65 decibels to barely audible, just the soft digital tick of the pulse instead of the aggressive beeping that drove people half mad. Webb watched her hands move through the adjustment, and something shifted in his expression, recognition, maybe, or just the acknowledgement of someone who understood that small mercies mattered. She was good with her hands. Anyone watching would have known that. The precision. The economy of motion. The way she didn't waste a single movement. "You from around here," he signed. "Virginia originally," she signed. "Raleigh now." He nodded and said nothing for a moment, which in ASL meant something different than silence. It meant processing. His eyes moved across her face with the methodical attention of someone trained to extract information from visual data alone. "You move like you've seen something." Sarah's hand stayed still. She didn't sign back immediately. Movement in ASL is harder to control than words. Any hesitation shows up in your body, any fear or tension transmits through your shoulders and hands. She kept her posture neutral, her face open, her breathing steady. "Everyone moves like that here," she signed finally. "Hospital job." Webb's hands came up. "No. Different." "You move like," he paused, searching for the right sign. "Like someone who's cleared a room before." She checked his for line instead of answering. The saline was running clear. His blood pressure was stable at 118/74. His O2 sat was solid at 97%. Everything was exactly as it should be. She documented it on the chart in handwriting that was methodical and small, designed not to draw attention. "Your son comes to visit." Webb signed. Sarah's hand stopped moving. She looked at him. He was watching her the way operators watch, which is to say he was watching everything, her hands, her pupils, the way her jaw tightened for exactly one frame before she controlled it. "He's 17, she said aloud, then switched to sign. "School keeps him busy." "His special operations candidate." She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The fact that Webb knew was the answer, and they both understood that. Her hands had revealed it. She'd gone too rigid, which was the same as admitting everything. "Good kid," Webb signed. "Tough. Took him and his platoon through pre-selection last year. He made it further than most." Sarah's hands remained perfectly still at her sides. The heart monitor continued its soft digital tick. Somewhere down the corridor, a ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, and the 24-hour ICU kept doing what it always did, keeping people alive by forcing air into their lungs and electricity through their hearts. "He's going to Sangin next month with 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines," Webb continued signing, his hands moving with the casual certainty of someone delivering information that was already locked in, already decided, already set into motion. "Dark Horse Company. Helmand Province. I'm briefing the unit before deployment." Sarah turned away. She moved to the monitor and checked the readings again, though she'd checked them 5 minutes ago. The light above the door cast her shadow across the linoleum floor like a shape that had learned to move independently. Sangin. The word was a location and a scar and a thing her body had been trained never to react to in public. She'd received the orders to disappear at a classified briefing. She'd signed documents promising never to speak about what happened there. She'd changed her name on her military discharge, moved to a city where nobody knew her, taken a nursing job that let her heal people without anyone asking questions about her own wounds. And her son was going to walk into the same valley. "I need to check other patients," Sarah signed without looking at Webb. "He doesn't know about you," Webb signed as she reached the door. "About what you did there. The brass buried it to protect intelligence sources. He thinks you worked. Administration thinks you got out because of a physical med board. He doesn't know Senior Chief Chen pulled his commanding officer out of an ambush when." Sarah turned back. Her hands came up and signed with the crisp precision of command, "Stop." Webb's hand stilled. The room went quiet except for the heart monitor's gentle digital tick. She could see him running calculations, reading her body language the way he'd been trained to read terrain, every slope and elevation telling a story about what would happen next. He doesn't know, Sarah signed slower, more deliberately. And he doesn't find out. Not from you. Not from anyone. He makes his own choices. He makes them with incomplete information, Webb signed. He makes them as himself, Sarah signed back. Not as someone's daughter. She left the room before he could respond. The medication cart seemed to move harder down the corridor, or maybe that was just the additional weight of carrying two wars simultaneously, the one that had officially ended and the one that was about to begin. She made it to the break room at 1:44 a.m. and sat alone in the dark, hands shaking, the faded unit patch pressed against her heart through the lining of her jacket where nobody could see it. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song. Somewhere in the hospital, monitors beeped and ventilators wheezed and machines kept doing what they always did. And in room 447, Captain Marcus Webb lay in his hospital bed, watching the corridor, watching the place where Sarah had disappeared, already composing the message he would send to certain people who needed to know that the officer they'd buried in Sangin was alive and working the night shift at Oak Creek Memorial in Raleigh, North Carolina. What happened next changed everything. The physician's lounge at Oak Creek Memorial smelled like burnt coffee and privilege. Dr. Sterling announced it at 0800 with his cup raised like a toast, his voice carrying across the room with the casual cruelty of a man who'd never faced consequences. $50 says the new night nurse, what's her name, Chen, quits before Friday. She's got that deer-in-headlights look. Weak, tops. 4 doctors laughed. 2 looked away. Sarah heard about it from a resident who thought she should know, and she absorbed the information the way she absorbed incoming rounds in Sangin, as data, as pattern, as something to survive. 1 measured breath. Then she filed it and moved on. The cafeteria incident happened at 12:30 on Wednesday. Lunch rush. 60 staff members in line. The fluorescent lights cast everything in that particular institutional gray that made human skin look already dead. Sarah sat alone at a corner table, reviewing patient notes on a clipboard, when Dr. Sterling's elbow caught her tray with the precision of someone who'd practiced the motion beforehand. Soup, sandwich, coffee, all of it cascaded across her scrubs and onto the linoleum floor in a spreading archipelago of waste. The room didn't go silent immediately. It took 3 seconds for people to notice, to understand what they'd witnessed wasn't an accident. "Oh, sweetheart, you should be more careful where you put things," Dr. Sterling said loudly enough for 3 tables to hear. His smile had the quality of a predator showing its teeth before the strike. Sarah knelt immediately. Paper napkins soaked through in her hands. The other staff members watched, some with sympathy, some with the careful blankness of people who'd learned not to interfere with power. She didn't look up when his shadow fell across her. She didn't flinch when he spoke again, his voice dripping with false concern. "Some of us have actual medical work to do, you know." The words hung in the air like smoke. She continued cleaning, methodical, her movements precise as a surgical drill. This was not her first humiliation. This was not even her 100th. But it was the first one that was calculated to break her in front of witnesses, and that made it different. Then the chart hit the tiles beside her knee. Patient file. Pages scattering across the wet floor like confetti. "Pick that up, sweetheart." Not a request. A command. A test. "Some of us have actual medical work to do." He was watching her face now, waiting for the crack, the tremor, the moment when she would crumble and he could verify what he already believed, that she was just another tired nurse who didn't belong in his hospital. She gathered the pages with hands that didn't shake. Not because she was unmoved, but because her hands had learned not to shake under much worse circumstances. She rose to her full height, every vertebra settling into place like a rifle stock sliding home. 1 tear escaped, just one, which she wiped away without breaking eye contact. The room had gone completely still. Even the ventilation system seemed to pause. "I've been under fire in places you couldn't find on a map, doctor, this doesn't even register." Her voice came out flat, measured, with the particular timbre of someone whose composure was built on survival, not civility. She wasn't angry. Anger would have been a luxury. This was something deeper, the calm that comes from having already lost everything and discovered that you could still function. She set the chart on the nearest table and walked away, leaving him standing in a cafeteria that had transformed into something close to a crime scene, except the crime was invisible, internal, the kind of brutality that doesn't leave marks. That afternoon, he escalated. Because that's what threatened men do, they don't retreat, they expand. He CC'd her on an email to nursing administration questioning her unusual familiarity with trauma protocols and suggesting a comprehensive review of her credentials. The language was careful, professional, the kind of document that could be used in a deposition. By Thursday morning, he'd called 2 board members who owed him favors from nights when he'd steered profitable cases their way, contacted her references at hospitals where his friends worked, bringing pressure to bear through networks she hadn't even known existed. He brought in an HR investigator to examine irregularities in her hiring paperwork, irregularities he'd fabricated himself by claiming her previous employer had no record of employment dates, no record of her existence, as if he could erase her through sheer bureaucratic will. What he didn't know was that Sarah had spent 18 years being officially non-existent. She'd been trained to disappear. Her last position had been classified at the Pentagon level, which meant her employment records existed only in a vault that didn't appear on standard searches. Which meant his investigator would find exactly what Dr. Sterling had instructed him to find: nothing. A blank. A ghost in the system. Which would look, to anyone examining it without access to classified channels, like she had something to hide. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that while he was building his case against her through phone calls and fabricated documentation, Sarah was learning something that changed everything. Room 447 had become her refuge during breaks, the one place where Dr. Sterling's network couldn't reach. Captain Marcus Webb, the deaf Special Forces officer, the Purple Heart veteran, the man whose presence alone seemed to carry the weight of operations that would never be declassified, communicated in fluid ASL with a precision that made Sarah's hands respond before her brain could order them to stay still. He'd started asking about her knowledge of trauma protocols. She'd answered in sign language with the unconscious fluency of someone who'd used sign language in combat zones where silence meant survival, where a raised hand could communicate across 300 meters of hostile terrain. "You were there," he signed one evening, his dark eyes sharp as a scope. "In Sangin. I saw the unit patch when your jacket sleeve rode up." She froze. Every protocol about her buried identity screaming at her to deny it, to deflect, to maintain the cover she'd constructed so carefully over 18 years. But something in his expression, the particular exhaustion of someone who'd carried the same classified weight, who understood what it meant to have knowledge that couldn't be spoken, made her nod once. A single confirmation. A crack in the facade. He signed slowly, his fingers precise. "I was Special Forces liaison. 3rd Battalion element. I sent a lot of good people into that hell." Then, his voice steady through his hands, "including my best fire team leader. Kid named David Chen. Any relation?" The floor tilted. The room seemed to compress. Her son. Her David. The boy she'd sent to military school after his father died, the boy she'd kept at arm's length to protect him from her classified life, the boy who'd enlisted despite her silent prayers that he wouldn't, the boy who'd been assigned to Captain Webb's fire team in Sangin. The circle closing. The past reaching forward through 18 years of careful distance and grabbing her by the throat. "My son," she signed back, her hands trembling for the first time in front of anyone since Sangin. Captain Webb's face went grey. "He never told me his mother served. He never told me she was Senior Chief Chen from the extraction at Grid Whiskey 7. He paused, his eyes searching hers. "The one who pulled 12 people out of that ambush. The operation they buried." They sat in silence for 3 full minutes, 2 people carrying different pieces of the same classified operation, the weight of shared secrets settling between them like snow. Sarah's pager went off at 2148, code on the 2nd floor, a patient arrhythmia, the machinery of the hospital reasserting its demands. When she returned to room 447 at 0200, Webb was asleep, his breathing steady and even through the nasal cannula. But his chart had been updated. 3 CT scans ordered over the following week. All requested by Dr. Sterling. All routing through an imaging center called Precision Diagnostic Partners that she didn't recognize. All billing through a system that would generate 30% kickbacks according to the infrastructure she'd learned to read in hospital networks. He was moving faster now. He wasn't just trying to destroy her employment anymore. He was beginning to understand that she was reading his scheme, that her knowledge of trauma protocols extended to her understanding of which procedures were medically necessary and which ones were purely profitable. She was a threat that had graduated from administrative to operational. Which meant he would escalate from social humiliation to something more strategic, more calculated, more dangerous. Which meant the next 5 hours would change everything about how this story would end. Room for 47 became Sarah's refuge during the midnight break she didn't take. The door closed soft against the frame, cutting off the fluorescent hum of the corridor, and she sat in the vinyl chair beside Captain Marcus Webb's bed like someone finally allowing herself to breathe. Webb was awake most nights, the phantom pain in his left shoulder kept sleep at bay, and the morphine drip never quite dulled the restlessness that comes from a body trained for combat now confined to a hospital mattress. His death since a roadside IED took his hearing at 23, his hands moved with the same fluid precision that had once cleared a building in Helmand Province, and when Sarah shifted toward him, Webb's grey eyes found hers immediately. She signed slowly, "Can't sleep either." His hands answered before his voice did, a rough rasp shaped by years of forcing vocal cords to work around trauma. "Pain is data." He smiled, remembering. "You know that term." "I know a lot of things," Sarah signed back, and something in her expression made Webb pause, his head tilting slightly, the way men who've survived ambushes develop an instinct for hidden depth. She'd learned ASL long before nursing school, learned it in briefing rooms and forward operating bases, learned it because communication saves lives and silence kills. Her hands were fluent in a language most nurses never bothered to learn, and Webb watched her move through his medical history with the precision of someone who'd been trained to extract actionable intelligence. "Sangin," he signed, a question that meant everything. She'd mentioned casually that she knew the valley, knew the 2013 rotation, knew the smell of dust that never quite washed out of your gear. She hesitated, the smallest pause, a fraction of a second that Webb's trained eye caught like movement on a thermal scope. Then she nodded. "Different unit. Different rotation." "How different?" His hands asked the real question, "How close?" "Did you know people I knew? Did you see what I saw?" Sarah pulled out her phone, scrolled to her notes, and showed him a photo she carried like a prayer card, her son in dress blues, pinned insignia showing junior officer rank, photo taken at commissioning 3 years ago. She pointed to Webb, then to the phone screen, and Webb's entire body went rigid against the mattress. His hands were shaking when he signed Marcus Webb. "I commanded Charlie Platoon, 2nd rotation, Sangin." "Is he?" "He survived," Sarah signed. "Steady." "He's my boy." Webb closed his eyes, and Sarah saw his throat work against emotion that had nowhere to go but inward. When his hands moved again, they carried weight, the ambush in July. Helmand River Complex. "We took indirect fire from 3 positions, were pinned in a narrow valley, and," he stopped, looked at Sarah directly. "Your boy kept 2 Marines alive with a tourniquet application and sheer will. Kid was 19. Sarah's jaw tightened. She already knew this. Her son had told her in fragments over encrypted calls, never the whole picture, protected her the way children try to protect their mothers from truth too heavy to carry. But hearing it confirmed by a man who'd been there, a man Webb's rank and bearing meant she could trust completely, made the memory concrete and terrifying in a new way. "He was a good Marine," Webb signed. "One of the best I've trained." "Your genes." Sarah looked away, at Webb's monitor, his heart rate climbing from 62 to 71 beats per minute. "He doesn't know about me. About what I was." "I won't tell him," Webb signed. "Then, but he should know. Mothers like you don't raise sons like him by accident." The conversation shifted then, into stories Webb could tell her about her son's recovery, his early leadership, the decision to stay in after his first contract. Sarah absorbed every detail like water finds cracks, and Webb, perhaps because he'd been isolated since the explosion, perhaps because Sarah was the only person who'd looked at him without pity, spoke freely about Sangin in ways that made her chest constrict. He talked about the village south of the forward operating base, about children who collected empty brass casings, about a medic named Hendricks who talked to himself about his daughter's soccer matches to stay focused during firefights. Sarah recognized the stories from her own rotation, from the same year, and realized with sudden clarity that they'd been operating in the same space, breathing the same air contaminated with cordite and dust, maybe even crossing paths in some unnamed compound while hunting the same intelligence targets. What happened next didn't just change how she saw Webb, it changed what she knew about Dr. Sterling. On her second night after the cafeteria incident, Sarah accessed the hospital's billing records during her break, something she could do with her nursing credentials but shouldn't have been doing without authorization. The password protocols were loose, and she had exactly 43 minutes between bed checks. She pulled up Captain Webb's imaging orders: CT chest with contrast on admission, CT abdomen pelvis on day 2, CT angiogram chest on day 4. 3 separate CT studies ordered by Dr. Sterling, each one carrying a radiation dose roughly equivalent to 400 chest X-rays. Webb's initial presentation was a penetrating trauma wound with stable vitals, clear lung fields on initial portable film, and no indication for repeat advanced imaging. She cross-referenced the orders against the hospital's usual imaging contractor, Metropolitan Radiology, which had been the system's partner for 12 years. But the charges on Webb's account routed to somewhere else: Precision Diagnostic Partners, a facility located in a medical plaza on Wade Avenue, the same plaza where a property record search revealed Dr. Sterling's brother-in-law, Gregory Marks, was listed as managing partner. Sarah pulled the billing codes, $4,847 for each CT, marked as urgent outpatient imaging, but the charges appeared on accounts for patients who were currently admitted to Oak Creek Memorial and could have been scanned in-house using equipment that cost the hospital nothing per procedure beyond staffing. She documented everything: timestamps, patient names, referral patterns. Over 12 days, Dr. Sterling had referred 17 imaging procedures to Precision Diagnostic Partners. 17 procedures that duplicated in-house capability. 17 procedures that generated approximately $82,399 in charges to Medicare, Medicaid, and private insurers. She pulled Medicare's standard allowance tables and found the billing 78% above standard regional rates. The math was simple: if Precision Diagnostic Partners kicked back 30% to Dr. Sterling, his take on those 17 patients alone was roughly $24,720 in 12 days. Sarah's training in classified briefings, in threat analysis, in reading patterns nobody else noticed, all of it crystallized into a single image: a man stealing from a system designed to save lives. A man who'd bullied her, a man who'd fabricated investigation reports to erase her, a man who was now committing federal fraud against Medicare. The decision point arrived at 0134 hours, as Sarah sat in the break room with Webb's chart across her knee and the imaging data printed on her phone. She could walk away. Senior Chief Petty Officers understand operational security better than anyone. Expose Dr. Sterling, and the investigation would pull records. And someone would notice the hiring gap in her employment background, notice the security clearance boxes she'd left blank, notice the way her previous address traced to a classified facility that doesn't officially exist. The Pentagon had ordered her to disappear after the operation in Sangin was erased, ordered her identity compartmentalized, ordered her to build a new life that left no connection to her previous one. 17 years, and she'd done exactly that. Night shift nurse at a regional hospital. Invisible. Safe. Exposing Dr. Sterling ended all of that. It ended invisibility. It meant interviews and background checks and federal investigators asking questions about where she'd been for the missing 8 years between her last legitimate employment record and her sudden appearance at Oak Creek Memorial. It meant risking the career she'd rebuilt, the anonymity she'd purchased with blood and sacrifice, the protective distance between her old life and the woman her son believed his mother had always been. But Webb was stable now. His breathing had improved, and his wound was closing. He would survive. And 17 other patients, maybe more, if she looked deeper, had been subjected to unnecessary radiation exposure so Dr. Sterling could fund a lifestyle that required kicking back thousands of dollars per month. 17 patients plus Webb plus every future patient Dr. Sterling was already planning to exploit. Sarah pulled out her phone at 01 for 7 hours and composed a formal report to the hospital's compliance hotline, a detailed accounting of the imaging pattern, the billing irregularities, the external contractor arrangement, the apparent financial conflict of interest. She did not sign it. She did not identify herself. She simply documented facts in the kind of precise, actionable language that investigators understood, and hit send. She had no way of knowing that the FBI had been monitoring billing fraud at Oak Creek Memorial for 6 months. She had no way of knowing that her employment record, the hiring gaps, the security clearance indicators, the classified background that she'd tried so hard to bury, had triggered automated audit protocols buried deep in federal databases, the kind of protocols designed to flag when someone with a protected operative status suddenly appeared on a hospital payroll. Her single email to the compliance hotline generated an alert that bounced across 3 federal agencies within 42 minutes. Dr. Sterling wouldn't find out about the fraud investigation for another hour. But Carol Winters, the director of nursing, would be called into a meeting with hospital administration by 0600 hours. And by 1400 that afternoon, Dr. Sterling would be in her office with printouts of Sarah's falsified employment records, with an investigator's preliminary report citing gaps in verification, with a formal complaint alleging that Sarah had made unfounded accusations against attending physicians to cover her own inadequacies. The room went dead silent when Carol Winters read the evidence Dr. Sterling had fabricated, when she looked at the supposed gaps in Sarah's hiring documentation that he'd manufactured himself, when she understood that one of her best night shift nurses had suddenly become a problem that required immediate termination. Sarah left the director's office and found Dr. Sterling waiting by the nurse's station, his smile cold and precise as a scalpel incision. "You should have taken the hint and quit, sweetheart," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Now you'll be fired instead, and with the questions around your background, good luck finding work anywhere in healthcare. Nobody hires nurses with hiring irregularities. Nobody hires people who make false accusations. You're done." Sarah held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds. Then she said, quietly, "I'm going on break." She turned toward the break room, her heart rate steady at 68 beats per minute, her hands absolutely still, her composure wrapped around her like body armor. What she didn't say was that she'd already filed the fraud report. What she didn't say was that somewhere in a federal building, investigators were opening a file with her name and Dr. Sterling's name on the same page for the first time. What she didn't say was that the next 5 hours would bring a phone call that would change everything. Behind her, Dr. Sterling's smile faltered, confused by the absence of fear in a woman he was certain he'd already destroyed. The code bell screamed at 0320 from room 447, a sound that cut through the quiet of night shift like artillery fire. Respiratory distress. Sarah's feet were already moving before the charge nurse finished the page, her body remembering how to respond to emergencies that didn't wait for committees or protocols. She reached Captain Webb's bedside as his lips turned blue, not the pale blue of cold fingers, but the deep cyanotic blue that meant oxygen wasn't reaching his tissues. His trachea was deviated hard to the left. Breath sounds absent on the right side. Tension pneumothorax. She called for the crash cart. Called for respiratory. Called for any available physician, but the night attending was in the ER with a multi-vehicle trauma and Dr. Sterling, listed as backup, wasn't answering his page. The silence where he should have been was its own kind of answer. Webb's oxygen saturation dropped to 78. Then 72. The monitor beeped in accelerating panic, a rhythm that didn't care about scope of practice or civilian hospital policy. Sarah's hands moved on their own, not from hesitation, but from the opposite, from absolute clarity. 12 years. 3 combat tours. 100 emergency battlefield traumas. Her fingers found the landmarks on Webb's chest like reading a map she'd memorized in blood, the second intercostal space, the midclavicular line. She prepped the site with antiseptic that smelled like every operating theater she'd ever worked in, sharp, clean, metallic. Her hands were steady as a surgical laser as she selected the 14-gauge catheter from the crash cart. Webb's eyes met hers for 1 second, terrified, trusting, asking without words if she knew what she was doing. She didn't break his gaze. She performed the needle decompression with the precision of someone who'd done it in a sandstorm with rounds snapping overhead. The needle entered the pleural space and released its pressure in a hiss of air that sounded like letting go, like months of holding her breath finally allowed to escape. Webb's color improved immediately. His oxygen saturation climbed, 78 to 82 to 88. The monitor steadied into something resembling sinus rhythm. Respiratory arrived 3 minutes later with the chest tube kit, and by then the crisis had shifted from life or death to manageable. The resident who showed up to supervise the chest tube insertion stopped mid-step, looking at Webb's stabilized vitals, looking at Sarah, and said only, "What did you do?" "My job," she said quietly. Dr. Sterling appeared at 04:05, 45 minutes after her first page. He smelled faintly of bourbon and expensive cologne, the kind that tried to mask what lurked beneath. He reviewed the chart in silence, reading Sarah's careful documentation of the needle decompression, the time stamps, the vitals recovery. His smile when he looked up at her carried the weight of a man who'd just been handed exactly what he needed. By 0800, he'd convened an emergency peer review committee. By 1100, he was presenting his case with the careful precision of someone who'd weaponized policy before. A nurse with falsified credentials. Performing procedures beyond her authority. Making unfounded accusations against attending physicians. Demonstrating a pattern of insubordination and recklessness that endangered patients. The DNS, Director of Nursing Services, tried to argue that Sarah had saved a patient's life, that any reasonable person would have done the same in those circumstances. Her voice was soft at first, gathering strength like someone finding courage. Senior Chief Chen performed an emergency intervention that kept Captain Webb alive until respiratory could. Senior Chief. Dr. Sterling's laugh was a knife wrapped in velvet. She's a registered nurse. That citation you're reading is fabricated. We're investigating her credentials now. But he'd already done more than that. He'd activated his full network, board members who owed him favors for referrals and kickbacks, legal counsel eager to cite liability exposure and protect the hospital's insurance coverage, the outside investigator whose report on her irregular background had been ready to go for 2 days, waiting only for the moment to deploy it. The investigator sat across the conference table, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and a folder full of selective facts, gaps in employment history that made sense only if you didn't know about classified operations, address changes that correlated with witness protection relocation protocols, a social security number that had been reassigned under federal protection. The termination letter was drafted by 1200. Signed by 1345. Security escorted Sarah out of Oak Creek Memorial at exactly 1400, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, when everyone could see her carrying a cardboard box, when everyone could know she'd been expelled. Inside the box was her stethoscope, a coffee mug from a pediatrics unit fundraiser she'd worked 5 years ago, and the jacket with its faded unit patch sewn carefully inside the lining. 15 years of service reduced to cardboard and shame. She was home by 14:30, sitting at her kitchen table with termination papers spread in front of her like evidence in a court case that was already decided. The papers said she'd endangered patients. The papers said she'd acted recklessly. The papers said she'd fabricated her credentials and demonstrated a fundamental disregard for hospital protocol. None of the papers mentioned Captain Webb. None mentioned that his oxygen saturation had been 68 when she started, that he would have been dead in 4 minutes without the needle decompression, that she'd held his life together with hands that remembered exactly how to do it because she'd done it 100 times before, in places that didn't exist on official maps, under circumstances that would never appear in official documents, for people she'd sworn never to acknowledge. When her 15-year-old son David found her at 1500, exactly 5 hours before her shift would have ended, exactly 5 hours before she would have clocked out and driven home knowing she'd saved a life, he stood in the kitchen doorway and watched his mother cry in a way he'd never seen. Not quiet tears. Not the composed drip of someone processing loss. This was the kind of crying that came from the core, from having sacrificed everything including her identity to keep people safe, only to be destroyed by a man stealing from the system she'd bled to protect. "Mom." His voice cracked. "Why are you home?" She couldn't answer. Couldn't tell him that the cost of keeping him safe had just been tallied and collected. Couldn't explain that she'd walked into that hospital a nurse and walked out as nobody, no name, no credentials, no record that she'd ever existed in any official capacity. The termination papers didn't list a reason she could speak aloud. Just performance management. Just a restructuring decision. David dropped his backpack and moved toward her, then stopped. Something in his face shifted, not from confusion, but to sudden understanding. He left the kitchen and returned 5 minutes later carrying a shadow box he'd found in the attic while looking for old photos. Inside were medals mounted behind glass, ribbons in precise rows, and a photograph of a woman in dress uniform, his mother, but not as he'd ever known her. The woman in the photo carried herself like someone who commanded rooms, like someone whose presence made the air pressure change. Her eyes in that photograph held a depth that matched nothing in the life he'd watched her live. "Mom, why is this hidden?" She looked at the shadow box and couldn't speak. The woman in that photograph officially didn't exist. She'd been ordered to disappear after Sangin, after the operation that would never be declassified, after 12 of her men had been pulled out of an ambush that nobody was supposed to know about. She'd built a new identity from the ground up, Sarah Chen, the night shift nurse, invisible and quiet and no threat to anyone because no one could see what lay beneath. Now even that was gone. At 3 p.m., Sarah's 15-year-old son found her at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a cold coffee mug, tears streaming down her face in a way he'd never witnessed before. David froze in the doorway, backpack still slung across one shoulder. His mother didn't cry. Not when Grandpa had his heart attack. Not when she worked double shifts for 3 months straight to cover his SAT prep courses. Not ever. He dropped his bag and moved toward her, voice careful. "Mom? Why are you home?" She lifted her eyes to his, and something shattered in her chest. The truth sat behind her teeth like a loaded weapon, that she'd been fired for saving a life, that Dr. Sterling had destroyed her for performing an emergency procedure that kept Captain Webb breathing, that her entire existence was collapsing because she'd finally used skills she was supposed to have buried forever. But David didn't know who his mother really was. No one did. And telling him now would only drag him into the classified past she'd spent 18 years trying to protect him from. "Hard shift," she said instead, voice thin. "They sent me home early." It wasn't technically a lie. He sat down beside her, reaching for her hand, and she let him hold it even though her hands were the ones that had pulled 12 men out of an ambush, that had performed field medicine on arterial bleeding, that had been ordered to disappear and become someone else entirely. She squeezed his fingers gently. "Everything's fine, sweetheart. I just need to rest." But everything wasn't fine. Everything was collapsing, and she couldn't tell him why. The next 4 hours stretched like a held breath. Sarah moved through her house like a ghost, opening her laptop and staring at job postings she couldn't see, her mind replaying the moment Sterling's face had twisted as she was escorted out by security. 14 years of nursing school, licensing, perfect evaluations, and one classified operation she couldn't talk about was all it took to erase her. At 6:16 p.m., David came downstairs with his laptop. "Mom, I need to ask you something." Her stomach tightened. "Okay." He bit his lip, the gesture so familiar it hurt. "When I was getting my PE clothes from the attic today, I found something. A box. It had your name on it, but it's really old, and there's patches and medals in it, and I don't understand." The blood drained from her face. The shadow box. She'd hidden it so carefully, pushed it to the far corner of the attic in a plastic bin marked holiday decorations, convinced it would stay buried forever. Convinced that chapter of her life would stay classified, untouched, unknown. "David, that's not," but before she could finish, her phone buzzed. An unknown number. Then another buzz. Then a text from a number she recognized, Dr. Patricia Hayes, the trauma nurse who'd always been kind to her, board emergency meeting right now. Something's happening. Come to the hospital immediately if you can. Sarah's hands went numb. She texted back, I was terminated this afternoon. The response was immediate, not anymore. Please come. By 6:55 p.m., Sarah was in her car, driving toward Oak Creek Memorial with her son in the passenger seat, the shadow box on his lap. He kept opening it, pulling out the faded unit patch, the ribbons, the medals carefully arranged in the velvet compartments. Mom, this Navy Cross, that's the highest medal a Navy person can get, right? I learned about it in history class. She didn't answer. Couldn't answer. When they pulled into the hospital parking lot at 7:04 p.m., exactly 5 hours after she'd been escorted out by security, David was holding the shadow box against his chest like a talisman. Sarah parked near the administrative entrance and they walked through corridors she'd walked 1,000 times, past the nursing station where she'd worked, past the break room where Sterling had mocked her, past all the places where she was supposed to be invisible. The board meeting was in conference room C. Through the glass walls, she could see Thomas Whitmore, the board chairman, sitting at the head of a long table with 6 other board members. FBI Special Agent Michael Martinez was there, his ID clipped to his blazer. Patricia Hayes stood near the window. And standing in the doorway, backlit by the harsh fluorescent overhead, was a man in dress Navy uniform, the insignia on his shoulder marking him as a SEAL team leader. It wasn't a request. It was a command. David walked forward before Sarah could stop him, his voice shaking as he held out the shadow box. I found this. In our attic. I think you need to see this. The room went absolutely still. Whitmore reached for the box, opened it, and his eyes widened. Patricia gasped, her hand covering her mouth. The SEAL officer stepped forward, and Sarah's breath caught because she recognized him now, not from the Navy, but from Sangin, from a photograph she'd seen in classified briefing materials years ago. Commander James Breaker Holloway. Task Force leader. The man who'd authorized the operation that had nearly gotten her killed and definitely got her son's commanding officer shot. Whitmore lifted the Navy Cross citation from the box and began reading aloud, his voice cutting through the silence like a surgical blade. Navy Cross citation. Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen. For extraordinary heroism in action against the enemy in Sangin Valley, Helmand Province, Afghanistan, on the date of May 14, 2009. Subject to classified operational security protocols, the citation describes actions resulting in the safe recovery of 12 combat personnel during a compromised position ambush. He paused, looking up from the papers. May 14, 2009. That's 18 years ago. Patricia's eyes found Sarah's across the room, and tears were streaming down her face. Sarah, those wounds we treated when you first came to Oak Creek, the shrapnel scars on your shoulders, the surgical tape over the old sutures, she couldn't finish. Breaker stepped into the conference room fully, his presence filling the space like a presence that made the air pressure change, and when he spoke, his voice was the kind that had commanded men in firefights. I need to tell you what Senior Chief Chen did. He opened a small folder, removing a photograph. It was a unit patch, faded desert tan with a trident emblem, mounted under glass in what looked like a memorial display case. This patch is mounted in the Special Operations Memorial at Naval Base San Diego. Every operator who passes through there knows exactly what happened on May 14 in Sangin. He placed the photograph on the table. Our forward operating base was overrun. The insurgent force was larger than intelligence indicated, 40-plus fighters, coordinated attack, came from 3 vectors. My platoon was pinned in a concrete structure with 2 wounded personnel and limited ammunition. Position was compromised. ETA for reinforcement was 23 minutes. We didn't have 23 minutes. Sarah's hands were shaking now, and she couldn't stop them. David reached for her, squeezing her fingers. Breaker continued, his voice steady as concrete. Senior Chief Chen was attached to our unit as a medical advisor. Non-combat role, per her orders. When the ambush started, she moved to our position under direct fire, documented by 3 separate witnesses, all of them still alive because of what she did next. He looked directly at Sarah. She performed emergency field medicine on 2 soldiers while returning effective fire. Then she conducted a tactical movement to extract a 3rd team member who'd been separated from the main element. 400 meters. Through active engagement zones. She extracted that operator and 2 others in the process, getting rounds through both legs for her trouble. The room held its collective breath. Whitmore's jaw clenched. One of the board members was openly crying. Breaker set another photograph on the table, a military record, name redacted, dates classified. The operation was sealed immediately after. Compartmentalized. The initial incident reports are still classified to this day, protection of intelligence sources and operational methods. But the medal record? That was submitted through proper channels. Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism in action against the enemy. He leaned forward, hands flat on the conference table. Senior Chief Chen didn't just save 12 lives that day. She fundamentally changed the operational capability of her unit. She went back into the fight with 2 gunshot wounds and extracted 3 more personnel while suppressing enemy fire. His eyes moved to Sarah. That patch is in the memorial because what you did that day became doctrine. Every unit in JSOC studied that extraction. Your actions became the template for how we train combat recovery under fire. The silence that followed wasn't quiet, it was the silence of an entire room reorganizing their understanding of reality. Then Agent Martinez stepped forward, opening a leather-bound case and placing several documents on the table. I'm with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. 6 months ago, we initiated an investigation into billing fraud at Oak Creek Memorial. Unnecessary imaging referrals being routed through an unlicensed private imaging center. Significant kickback structure. He pulled out bank statements, wire transfers, email threads. When Senior Chief Chen was hired at this hospital, her background check triggered automated audit protocols designed to protect classified federal operatives in civilian employment. That flag triggered our fraud investigation to accelerate. We found what Dr. Sterling has been doing. Martinez turned to face the board. Directly. Over the past 18 months, Dr. Sterling ordered unnecessary imaging on 47 patients, netting him approximately $84,000 in undisclosed kickback payments through a shell company controlled by his brother-in-law. Captain Marcus Webb, the patient who came in with a tension pneumothorax, was supposed to receive 3 separate CT scans, despite the fact that a single chest X-ray and clinical assessment would have been sufficient for diagnosis. He spread the documents. That procedure would have netted Dr. Sterling $4,200. Senior Chief Chen prevented that fraud by saving his life with appropriate emergency care. The conference room door swung open. Dr. Sterling stood in the threshold, face flushed red, hand reaching for his phone. I don't know what you're talking about. Those were all clinically indicated, they weren't, Martinez said flatly. We have testimony from your brother-in-law's billing manager, who took a deal yesterday. We have email communications between you and him discussing kickback percentages. We have 47 patient charts with your handwritten orders for unnecessary procedures. Sterling's face went from red to white in the span of 3 seconds. He looked around the conference room at Whitmore's expression of ice, at the FBI agent's steady gaze, at the SEAL commander in dress uniform standing witness to his destruction. His hand trembled. I'm calling my attorney. This is a witch hunt. I have friends on this board, had friends, Whitmore said, standing slowly. His voice was carved from granite. Robert Chen, the retired healthcare executive who just resigned from the board, is your friend. Except he's not your friend. 3 months ago, he began documenting your billing patterns after his daughter-in-law, Senior Chief Chen, noticed the statistical anomalies in imaging referrals. He brought those concerns to federal authorities. Sterling's face collapsed. Security, Whitmore said quietly. Escort Dr. Sterling from this building. Contact the Raleigh Police Department and the Medical Licensing Board. This facility is pressing charges for fraud, billing conspiracy, and patient endangerment. Sterling tried one more play, his voice rising. That nurse violated protocol, performed procedures outside her scope, falsified her entire employment record, Patricia Hayes stood. Her voice came out with the precision of a surgical strike. Senior Chief Chen's credentials are legitimate. Her service record was classified and archived under federal protection protocols. I just verified everything with the Naval Personnel Command. You've been committing Medicare fraud. Sterling was escorted out at 7:11 p.m., his hands shaking as security guided him through the hospital. By 8:15 p.m., local news crews were setting up in the main lobby. The board chairman stepped to a microphone at 8:22 p.m., cameras rolling, and read a statement about immediate termination for fraud and patient endangerment. Sarah Chen watched it happen from inside the conference room, her son beside her, still holding the shadow box that had changed everything. The next morning, Oak Creek Memorial called her back. Not just back with a formal apology signed by the entire board, back pay for the 14 hours she'd been terminated, and an offer she hadn't anticipated, Director of Emergency Services. Oversight of all trauma protocols, staff training, departmental policy. She accepted on one condition, that Captain Webb receive his care from Patricia Hayes' team, that all imaging referrals be double-checked against clinical necessity, and that the hospital implement a new oversight system for any referrals going to external imaging centers. They agreed immediately. Dr. Sterling surrendered his medical license 3 weeks later as part of a plea agreement that kept him out of federal prison but cost him $280,000 in restitution and a permanent ban from healthcare practice. Sarah learned through David's grandfather that Sterling was teaching CPR certification classes at a community college in Durham for $16 an hour, barely covering his legal fees. The faded unit patch, the one she'd kept sewn inside her jacket lining all those years, moved from contraband to a shadow box in her new office. Mounted beside her senior chief anchors. Mounted beside her Navy Cross citation. Mounted beside a photograph of the operation in Sangin, classified for 18 years, finally declassified for her promotion ceremony. Captain Webb attended that ceremony in dress uniform. He signed his thanks in fluent American Sign Language, and when she understood the meaning, "Thank you for giving me my life back," she allowed herself to cry, finally, in public, with her son's hand on her shoulder and her entire department witnessing the moment the nurse became the senior chief petty officer again. Her voice dropped back to its original octave that day. When she spoke to her staff during orientation, they heard the timbre of someone who'd commanded men under fire. You don't need a badge or a gun to be a warrior. You need the courage to stand when it costs everything, and the strength to keep serving even when no one knows your name. David Chen kept the shadow box in his room. 2 years later, when he enlisted in the Navy, he carried a photograph of his mother in dress uniform, understanding finally why she'd sacrificed 18 years of identity to keep people like him safe. That's a story about more than just one nurse's vindication. It's about the cost of invisible service and what happens when the truth finally comes home. If you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever hidden who you really are to protect someone else, Sarah Chen's story is a reminder that those sacrifices matter. Subscribe for more stories about the people who serve in silence, and comment below, what would you have done in Sarah's position?